Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm one of the journalist grantees here in Germany, actually in Berlin. So my project looks at the larger structure of memorialization, particularly Holocaust memorialization in Germany. However, for today, we don't have that much time, so we're really going to focus on the modern debate. So specifically, which memorials we should be looking at, and then what people are actually saying about the major trends that we're seeing, particularly in politics, and what that could mean for the future here. So I'm happy to take any questions at the end about anything to do with structure of memorialization in Germany and politics, but that's what we're going to be focusing on here. So we'll start by looking at a few of the actual memorial types. Just to let you know how I define memorial as far as my project goes, I'm looking at anything that represents memory of the Holocaust in terms of its victims, and anything that also produces pedagogy. That way we have something to actually measure. One example that we see here is Stolpersteine. Some of you may be very familiar with this, and some of you may not know at all, so I'm going to go on a very basic level as to which things we are looking at here. This Stolpersteine is called stumbling blocks, and they're literally on the street in front of the houses of people that were victims of the Holocaust in one way or another, and they talk about the fate. So if you look here, you see that they're talking about two different people who were murdered in Auschwitz, and they were deported in 1943. So that's the kind of information you're going to see on that. Because this is a type of memorialization that does not really be supported by the German government itself, it's actually one of the more controversial topics in memorialization, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes as well. So here we have the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, right here in Berlin. You might see it during your time here if you haven't already. And it's the largest memorial that was actually created by the German government. So this one is also rather controversial for that reason, so we'll talk about that as well. But it's one that is most thought of as the main memorial for the Jews in Europe. We have this here. This is one example of a different type of memorial. So this is actually the concentration camp Dachau and their education center that has formed afterwards. So this is obviously a very different type of memorial because it has to do with the actual space itself. So this space form of memorialization brings a different kind of debate with it. So particularly these kinds of memorials that are on the former concentration camps, they're going to be where a lot of modern day protests are held, particularly by radical groups, as well as anti-memorialization groups that we'll talk about. We also have here Topography of Terror, also in Berlin. This one is on the former site of the Gestapo headquarters or the state police during the Nazi time. And this one, it does a very good job of talking about the actual role of the Nazi government in executing the Holocaust as we know it. And so it's that kind of focus that we'll see there. Here we also have documentation centers. So this is mostly archival space and research areas. This particular one is in Cologne, but there are also forms of memorialization because they talk about what was going on in the space during that time period. So in the example of Cologne that I also look at here, this was also the site of a Nazi prison. And so they go through a lot of the experiences that you see with political prisoners and also with POWs that were held at different times in this area. And then lastly, as you might have noticed, most of the memorials that I'm looking at, or that are the big ones on the scene in the debates, either deal with Jewish victims or they don't deal with a particular victim group especially. There are, however, many examples of memorials that do. This is one example of the memorial to the Roma and Sinti, and this is also in Berlin. So it's important to think about when we're talking about this modern debate that we're looking at, that there are also kinds that deal with different groups, and they have a different context as well. So when we're talking about this debate, there are so many different groups that have a voice in this. And this is not going to be an exhaustive conversation that we're going to have about this. What I'm looking at, though, is two of the largest voices that we're seeing right now in Germany talking about opposing memorialization, and they come from very different backgrounds and have very different perspectives. So the first one that we'll touch on here is going to be the far right-wing movement in Germany. You might be familiar with the AfD. It's already been talked about a little bit this morning in the earlier presentation, and they're kind of a right-wing movement that has actually been able to make it into the German government recently. There are also a lot of other right-wing groups that might be a little bit smaller and less known that also are opposing memorialization for various reasons. Obviously, this is a generalization to say not all right-wing parties oppose memorialization, but in the big picture, their sentiment is that they are against Holocaust memorialization because it is against this idea of national pride. So it's basically, they see it as Germany as shaming itself, and they see this as being in many ways against what Germany should be doing, which is talking about the good things that it's doing. So the example that we have here is Björn Höcke. He is a member of the AfD, and back in January of 2017, he was in Dresden and gave a talk where he said something to the equivalent of that Germany is the only country that has a memorial of shame in its heart. So that's talking about the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. This was very, very controversial even within his party, but it represents a very large push within the right wing that they want to move away from this memorial culture that Germany has and go to leave that in the past, is more or less the language that they use. The other group, however, that's a little bit from a different perspective, is actually going to be the Jewish community, particularly the conservative Jewish community that we're going to see in certain cities. So their perspective is obviously very, very different. It's not so much that they, in many ways, oppose memorialization, but rather how it currently exists in Germany. So we touched on the fact that a lot of memorials are done by the state, a lot of memorials are done particularly by the German government. A lot of people see this as being a problem in the Jewish community, particularly these older Jewish people that are connected with the Holocaust, because they see this as not being done by the victim groups themselves, but rather by the children of those who were complicit during this time. Another reason that they largely oppose the memorialization as it exists is because of how the language is used. So they say that in a lot of cases it's using Nazi language and that this doesn't give humanity to the victims. One excellent example of another reason, however, occurs in Munich and involves this woman here, Charlotte Knochblau, and she is the leader of the Jewish community in Munich and is part of the Jewish council there. Recently, Stolpersteine, the group that we were talking about earlier with the stumbling stones outside of people's homes, they came to Munich and proposed to put some stones there for some of the victims. However, this was actually turned down and is continually being turned down to this day. The reason for that is because the Jewish community there feels that this is not appropriate to do because these stones are on the ground, and they actually find that disrespectful to the communities that were targeted during this time. In addition to that, they say that the artist who is taking care of this was not Jewish, he's not a victim group, and thus this is perpetuating this language. Other reasons that you're going to see among the older Jewish community is going to be the fact that they find that the current structure as it exists with so many memorials and so many diverse types is that it makes a commercialization of Holocaust memorialization instead of actually focusing on the victims themselves. What's important to note here, though, before we go on, is just the fact that this represents the older community, the conservative community within Jewish groups, and does not represent all Jewish advocacy groups going for memorialization as a whole. Also important to underscore there is that they're not against memorialization so much as how it currently exists in Germany in many cases. Gotcha. So what then we can then draw from that? You know, there's a lot of different things that are going on in Germany right now, and taking a more journalistic lens, as I have, looking at different interviews and things like that, there's a lot of competing voices, but from the trends that we are seeing, we can draw some tentative conclusions about what we could see in the coming years for Germany in terms of Holocaust memorialization. The big things to note is that the right-wing parties are on the rise, as are nationalist sentiments that go along with them. So it's likely that we're going to see more debate and more dissenting voices in terms of Holocaust memorialization in the future. In addition to that, we're also going to see that these older, more conservative Jewish communities that are having a large voice against more of the localized Stolpersteine and other types of memorialization, they're not going to be as active anymore. So they're going to be being replaced by these new, more liberal, younger Jewish communities who see things very differently than their counterparts. So in short, we're going to see that it's going to be more localized, in my opinion, in these types of memorials instead of the big national ones that we've come to know in Germany, and likely there will be a lot more debate to come. So thank you, guys.